I'm ABC7's race and culture reporter, Will Jones, and I'm pleased to be your host for this week's town hall. You've probably been hearing a lot about mental health and that May is designated Mental Health Awareness Month. The messages are many that mental health is important. If you need help, go get help. You're not alone. It's important to talk with someone. We need to recognize the challenges and stressors facing so many people because of this pandemic, but also the unique situation for Black men who are facing mental health issues. So many are suffering in silence and in shame. Today's virtual town hall will explore this topic with professionals dedicated to working with this specific group. Our panel includes local community wellness advocates and clinical professionals who can speak to the trends in behavioral health, the impact of the pandemic on the mental health of Black men, and the innovative approaches they are taking to address mental health. I would like to remind our panelists that the discussions are intended to be less Q&A and more conversational between people of different voices and experiences, all encouraged to speak up to add their comments. And as always, we strive to do these town halls. We want to leave the viewers informed, inspired, and hopeful. Let's meet our guests. I'm really excited about this conversation. Dr. Obari Cartman is a community psychologist who specializes in Black male identity. I recently did a story with him on the South Side. Dr. Larry Turner is a licensed clinical psychologist, registered nurse, substance abuse, and certified yoga therapist. Anything else, Dr. Turner? Am I missing?
I just couldn't keep a job. I had to keep going.
Titani Harris is a psychotherapist, certified balanced living coach, author, and inspirational speaker. And finally, Erin Mallory is the founder and chief executive officer of Grow Community. Erin founded Grow Community to assist males, particularly males of color, that are often misunderstood. I want to go around to each of you. Let's start with Dr. Cartman, and let's just talk about some of the work you do with regard to mental health in Black men.
Well, first, let me say I appreciate y'all holding this forum and calling it Black Man, right? We in a moment where it's BIPOC, it's people of color, and I love the collaboration. I think that we need to hold arms and have solidarity, but every once in a while, it's important to have a very specific conversation because mental health is a specific condition. Like there's unique barriers, there's unique opportunities, there's unique treatments, and so as much as we can to focus in, to be surgical, like it's really, really useful in this moment right now. So thank y'all for having this. Again, community psychologist, I work with a couple organizations, program director for Room and Charities, where we do the weekly men's drum and yoga circles that you did the story on. I appreciate that. It was a dope story.
I'm coming back on my own without the camera.
I love it. I love it. And that was my experience. Like, I was like, I don't know about this yoga thing. Like, I know I need it, but I knew I wasn't even going to go to no class. Like, I didn't want to be embarrassing myself, bumbling around. So I'm like, create a space where I'm not embarrassed. It was a bunch of other men fumbling with this thing just like I am, and I got into it. Like, I really appreciate the metaphor of it, like the stretching and the breathing. And there's something the teacher always says about, like, challenge yourself to do this to your fullest expression, right? And I'll be in there trying, I know what the half version is. I know the lazy. I know what it means to cop out. But when I think about that in my life, that is the quest. Like, who am I at my fullest expression? Like, what is the most vibrant version of me? And that's what my work is, really to try to find ways to help men find that, to be their fullest self, to achieve their highest dreams or visions, to do it against opposition, right? So part of the Black man thing is that we got to talk about structural, systemic, historical opposition to our wellness, which is another part of, there's mental health movement. We talk about self-care and all that's happening, but the specific nuances for Black men are really critical. So, this is a group of folk that are doing that work. And so I think we can figure out a lot to just by coming together, by talking, by sharing, by collaborating. And that's what we need. So thank y'all for doing this.
Erin, I'm interested in your work with Grow Community. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so again, thanks for having me as well. Grow Community, we're a community mental health center located within the Roseland community of Chicago. And our mission is molding boys, strengthening men, restoring families and communities. And so our approach is that we provide male clinicians, male counselors that are able to go out and work with the young people that we work with, as well as adults that we work with. And so we work with a wide range of young men, young ones that maybe are struggling at home and mom is looking for some support, young guys that may be on probation and need some additional support and treatment to kind of, circumvent them from, being more involved with the criminal justice system, and providing pro-social behaviors. And then also men that are reentries or are coming home from prison or on parole. And so, one of the catalysts for creating this organization is that me as a clinician, starting off in this work, I would have caseloads full of boys that I would work with. And, when I would work with the family, go to the home, I was most of the time the only male contact that they had. They would come from a single family home with mom, and very, very limited interactions with a positive male figure. And so, it just started weighing on me a lot. Like, how do we address this need? And how do we, help these young people to be able to, see a male figure in a positive light, somebody that looks like them. And so hence, I started the process of Create and Grow. And so right now, we have a staff of male counselors, clinicians that are able to go out. We do in-home visits. We go around to the community, engage and work with them. And particularly, my passion, my heart are the young men that society has given up on, right? The ones who, people feel like are thugs or in these gangs or in these streets, who again, just, need some love, caring, and some support, and a lot of times our society has kind of, weighed them off because of, what they see, the stigma that's associated with them. But a lot of times what we learn that these young people are hurting, and they're looking for somebody who can, connect with them and really just address their needs.
Mm-hmm.
And Dr. Larry, you have a lot going on. And I was told you have the most experience of anyone here. So I want you to speak to that and just some of your roles that
Sure.
you do right now.
Yeah, right now I'm retired, thank God for that. But I started I started off as a nurse in the emergency room all down in South Side Chicago. Roseland Hospital was my first job. All down St. Bernard's, University of Illinois, and I got interested in the mental health piece when the projects were, and we would see the same people over and over coming into the emergency room, and especially those who wanted some mental health services. You could if they were. You can admit some, and some you can medicate and then send them home, but then they have a 30-day to 60-day wait to see a therapist. And then the thing is, are they going to go to the therapist? And then, so the emergency room was good for them. So I went back to school, became a psychologist. I back in the late 80s and the 90s was a great time. It was a great time for Black men and women too. There was a lot of organization, a lot of doing things. Philip Jackson was just starting. I was with Philip when he started the Black Star Project. Jawanza Kanjufu was doing Community of Men, and this was just on the South Side. And West Side, I'm quite sure was doing a lot of things. But just as Brother Mallory said, when these institutions were open, they would always be, for the most part, women bringing their sons or their little brothers in, and so we would never see them in. So I look at this as the therapy that we're taught. When you go to school, you're taught in a certain Eurocentric way. You sit down, check people's insurance, and you get to talking, and they leave there feeling good for about 5 minutes until they go back on to their mess. But therapy has to involve rhythm. It has to involve movement. That's why yoga is very important. The work that Dr. Cartman does, the drumming, there's the vibrations there. These are things that we need to bring into therapy. And I'm glad to see that a lot of therapists are getting into it. Yeah, we have to do the traditional European way of doing it, but there's a lot of cultural things that need to be brought into it. Because if the person is traumatized, the first thing that happens is, their muscles begin to tense up. And just tell me when to shut up. So, because I've always been involved with trauma. I was there in Hurricane Katrina, which was, never mind, I want to get off on that.
Well, you got time, make your point.
No, I mean, it wasn't handled well by FEMA. It was not. If it wasn't for different organizations like Reverend Jackson and other small groups sending water down to New Orleans, a lot of people might not have made it. FEMA was, I was with FEMA at the time. And I got a call just like on one of the movies. is this Dr. Turner? I said, yeah, we have a plane waiting for you, a ticket waiting for you to come down. And I'm like, what? You know, this is at 10 o'clock at night. So I went down there, it was 50 of us, and it was just so disorganized. The first day we spent just taking ID badges, the whole day. And, you know, but anyway, moving right along, there was the Haitian earthquake, and you get to see people working together. Their culture kept them strong. We did yoga down in Haiti, and the children, they love the children like to play. Therapy has to be play. They can't come sit in the office. You got to play with them, you know, and that's the whole thing. And the real key is we have to look at our educational system. How do we educate our children? Our children are not meant to sit down for 7 hours a day. You know, they need exercise every day. And really, they need a cultural influence in the classroom. You can identify the young men or the young women who are having problems in the 1st and 2nd grade. You can do some of it through testing, some of them through observing their behavior. So, and a lot of times what happened is little Johnny, who's a problem in 1st grade, you know, I don't think you could fail kids in 1st grade, but you pass them on anyway, even if they can't read. And then he's in 2nd grade and he's raising so much, I usually say a curse word right now, but he's raising a lot of difficulty. And he gets passed on to the 3rd grade. He can't read. And if you can't read by 4th grade, you know, when you're 15 years old in 7th grade, school has no interest for you. School. My last job was as a psychologist at the juvenile detention center. And I had the young boys, the ones 10 to 14. And they had their, you know, they were tattooed up and muscled up, even the young ones, you know, gang banging. The only time you could really get through to them is when they were after they were in a fight and they were placed in isolation. Then they had to do a written assignment and talk with me before they could get out. And most of them would ask me, can you help me write this? And you 14 years old. And of course, he's going right back to the same environment. So yeah, we have to work on the people, the young men and the people who need help, who are out here, and definitely got to have something about, let me write that down, reentry, got to have reentry. A lot of men don't come to school. Why? Because the way you do the volunteer system. Yeah, everyone shouldn't be allowed to come in school. Now, I understand the screening, but you've got to be selective in that. You can't just say, hey, oh, this guy, he been to Statesville, you know, he can't be around kids. Well, yeah, if he's a molester, he shouldn't be around kids. But if he's somebody's father, you know, maybe there's a story there that can help them to prevent someone else from going there. And so the key is to do the work, do the therapy in the school, in the school. I mean, it's just that not have a clinic in school, not have an after school program, but have a program set up so that when the child who's constantly getting sent to the principal's office because he's fighting at lunchtime or because he's acting up and he can't read, hey, he has a place to go. Well, maybe he could do some yoga. Maybe he can see a short, nice video. Maybe he can do some creative art things. Maybe he can beat on a drum. Maybe he can read a relevant story that holds his interest so he can learn how to pronounce those words. So all of these things, and you know, these things have been tried in some places, but you know, here in Chicago, we really need to center on what's going on. I think we have a great chance now. I mean, we're supposed to have an elected school board by now. We don't. But there's a lot of federal money and state money coming down supposedly for the schools. And so I'm looking forward to having the at least a chance of changing the way we teach our children. And the last thing I'll say forever, I'll be quiet forever and ever and ever.
Don't do that.
The Ebola crisis. Okay, so they had hyped up Ebola so much that a lot of well-meaning nurses and doctors weren't going. So when I went, I said, you know, and I, with my group, I was the only Black person there, the only Black clinician there, you know, and so they loved me. I had a problem, you know, but the thing is, they don't have the structure. No one has the structure that the United States has, and we did yoga there. And so now there's this thing called the African Yoga Project, not just because of me, but because of yoga has a way of bringing the mind, the body into alignment. And that's the whole thing. We need to do therapy and teaching in a different way. I'm done.
I appreciate that, Doc.
And you go get some water after saying a word.
that is water, isn't it, Dr. Turner? No, I think that part of what you're saying.
Can I chime in?
Yeah, we gotta get your intro in. So, Titania, what are you working on?
So, hi, first of all, thank you so much for putting this together. Thank you for this opportunity. I am excited about this conversation. I think oftentimes when we talk about mental health, Black men are not involved in the conversation. So thank you again for this. So I am Titania Harris. I am a psychotherapist, owner of TMH Man Cave, which mission is to eliminate the stigma and bring awareness to the mental health needs of Black men. And so part of our programming options includes our event series, which is an event where we bring men together for a panel discussion that focuses on everyday topics that includes trauma, mental health, of course, relationships, masculinity. And so in this work, I recognize that I was meeting with men one-on-one for traditional psychotherapy services, like Dr. Leary had mentioned, and I recognized they needed more than that. And so the TMH Man Cave event series was the opportunity to create a brave space where men could not only feel encouraged, but empowered to talk about what was happening for them. And so in this space, men have the opportunity to come together. And so I think this work is important because when I think about our healing as African Americans, I believe they start with the men in our communities, right? I also recognize that traditional talk therapy is not always the answer. And although our event series is not therapy, I recognize that it can be therapeutic. In addition to our event series, we also have an online wellness group that we started during COVID, because as I told someone, Black men were struggling with a pandemic within a pandemic, right? When we think about all the racial trauma with police brutality and systemic racism, right? And so we started this online wellness group where men can come and talk to a male therapist from TMH Man Cave team who leads these groups bi-weekly to talk about these things. And also it's a place where they can get culturally sensitive resources like Dr. Obari's Real Men Charities program and sort of benefit from some of that stuff. So thank you for this. This is great opportunity.
I want to talk about what is mental health. For a lot of Black men, we don't even know how to describe what is mental health. We know our physical health, but in terms of mental health, Dr. Obari, how would you describe mental health? What is it?
I definitely think that we need to have a definition that is unique to us. We're talking about culture over and over again, and talking about identity. We're talking about context, and in the way that the mental health movement is framed now, it's very much about like the self-care. It's kind of a superficial coping, managing, get back to work. And men are good at that. We're good at posturing. We're good at pretending like everything's held together. We good at, and I'm cool, bro. Like everything's fine. But like on the inside, like really crumbling, like falling apart. So the depth, the holistic definition of mental health has to do with a combined alignment of emotional, spiritual, financial, relationship, community health that is internalized in a way that is really a correction to the attack against Black men. A lot of us grow up feeling like Black men are lazy or throwaway and discardable or savage is what I'm hearing from the young boys. So we got to correct these images, these narratives that we taught from watching the TV and the news, no offense. And then we have to reinstill sort of this restored version of a self that is a productive member of a family. And so that includes having joy. Like Black men have a hard time smiling sometimes. That means having peace of mind, not just being a product, not just being a capitalist, not just being a breadwinner, not just being a cog in the wheel, but really having like purpose, having connecting to your destiny. I think we all created with a vision and a plan, and we lose sight of that. I'm saying real. We talking about the young people. There's something I see really in eighth grade. There's something that happens between eighth grade and high school where there's like this twinkle in the eye. And I got sons. They 5 and they 8, and it's important that I have sons because Mallory was talking about how easy it is to throw the boys away, but like you can't do that when they're yours. We these are our boys. Like this is when we see the news, we like, oh man, we lost some more boys on both sides of the gun. Like these are our people for real. And so it's not a profession. It's not like I'm not clocking in. I see my sons and these boys that I work with, and I can see when a twinkle in their eyes lost. I can tell when there's a numbness. I can tell when they've disconnected. And so part of the mental health work is to reinstill, reinvigorate, enliven, connect with something that's meaningful. Give them hope, give them purpose, support them, protect they mind from the attack that's happening. And it's really holistic. It's a multifaceted work. Like it's not just deep breathe. It's not just, make good decisions. It's not just pull your pants up, certainly. So that's why we got to have a bunch of people at the table to really have all the different pieces in this. The artists, the economics, the spiritual folk. All of us got to be at the table, not just the counselors.
Right, the psychological focus, right? I think it's also important, and Dr. Obari, you touched on this, and also addressing those emotional imprints, right? When you talk about juveniles in terms of some of the anger, some of that is because of those unaddressed emotional imprints that they've suffered with. And so I think it's important that we talk about this, and also thinking
about that emotional imprints.
So meaning like some of the things that they struggle with in terms of how they feel, right? And so what I mean is, think about, you said you have sons, right? And I have nephews and I have brothers. And I think about how when young boys are raised, the first time they express how they feel, they're told, stop crying, right? Be a man. And so lots of times I see men are being raised they're just raised not to be feminine, not to even be men, right? Because we associate femininity with emotion, right? So that's what I mean when I say that in terms of that. And so I think that's important, and changing that narrative.
Yeah. I get that.
Yeah, and thinking about that emotional imprint, right, and emotions, right, I think also when we think about mental health and what is it, right, it's also about how do we strengthen the mind and the mindset, right? How do we strengthen, these cognition, these thoughts that the young people have, or people just have in general, right? Like, because part of this is, like there's these maladaptive, these negative thoughts that may protrude, that may take over, whether that's due to experiences, what you've been exposed to, but they become so evasive, where now it shifts the mood, it shifts how you feel, it shifts how you act and how you engage, right? And so I think part of mental health is like, how do you guard that, how do you protect that, how do you build that, how do you strengthen that, right? And part of it is by therapy or counseling, but also I think there's also non-traditional approaches or new approaches, right? Innovative approaches, right? Like what you do with yoga, right? Or like I'm big on like also how to incorporate exercise, right? Diet, right? There's so many other factors that I think we have to have conversations about that contribute to our mental health. Because with mental health, that's our psyche. That's how we are able to function. That's how we see the world. That's how we perceive things. But it always goes back to our thought process and what are creating these thoughts and what are we allowing these thought processes to be.
Do you
and I'll also add to that real quick, social justice work, activism. Because a lot of the anger is justified. Like mad, so there's been a foot on your neck.
Exactly.
You should be angry about that. You don't have an anger problem. You got a system problem.
Exactly.
So getting young people to get beyond just making new decisions and changing these structures, there's healing in that. And I think there's a therapeutic part of like activism that we need to highlight too.
And it's intergenerational, right? Like if we go way back, we have to talk about the intergenerational trauma that we struggle with. And so I think also that's part of this conversation as well too.
Wow, you all are hitting on two great points. I want to start with the point that Dr. Obari was making about the current climate. And this climate has existed for decades and centuries in this country, but just talking about what we're experiencing right now, how does that impact mental health of Black men, what we're experiencing with police brutality, racism?
I mean, I think the part about it not being new is really important to start with. I'm glad you said that this is not the camera, the social media, the highlighting has brought it to light in ways that we're talking about more. But the fact that it's not new is really important. And the reason I highlight that is because we're also in a really crisis moment around suicides in the Black community. And a lot of people are having more panels. We're talking about like, why is the suicide increasing? And I love that question. But I think there's the other side of that question, which is, why was it not happening before? Because we've been through pandemics before.
Yep.
We've been through tough times before. What was it that held us together all this time? And what are those things that we're losing? What's eroding in our communities, whether it's spirituality, a family community, or diet? What have we lost that our young people are showing a mirror to, that's saying that we out here for real? We confused, we hurt, we ain't got no resources, we feel disconnected, we feel thrown away. Like, what are the young people telling us that is new? That we got to figure that out. Not a new solution, but maybe go back to an old solution, right? Maybe what are some of the things that we've given away in exchange for capital, in exchange for comfort, in exchange for proximity to whiteness? Like, what are some of the things that we've given away that have left our communities in chaos and vulnerable to suicide, more specifically, but also anxiety, depression, addiction, all these other things that are mental health problems that are exacerbated by the isolation of COVID, the unemployment, the lack of trust in the system. We saw the vaccine conversation happen where people are like, well, I don't know if I trust the government no more.
Right.
I appreciate you, CDC. Great recommendation, but you also flipping, right? So now we really out here for real. We really just out here, and I think that the generations of trauma and the hopelessness and the beating down and just like the despair just adds and adds and adds. And now George Floyd sparks that. It just reminds us that we can't just keep droning. We can't just just the robot in this wheel. We got to be alive, but we don't know how. Like we ain't got the tools. We got to. And some of it means going back. Some of it is retrieving and remembering and restoring.
Yeah.
And when you talk about trauma, I think it's important to distinguish between the post-traumatic stress disorder and the racial-based trauma, right?
Yeah.
Because I talk about how there's nothing post about the Black experience here in America, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is an ongoing trauma that we experience. So it's race-based, I would say race-based traumatic stress. I would love to get the guys' thoughts on that in terms of race-based traumatic stress versus post-traumatic stress disorder.
Who wants to break that down?
Well, I got a couple thoughts, right? So, when we think about trauma, right, or race-based trauma, right, and we think about epigenetics, right? We think about just how trauma is able to be passed down from one generation to other generation, right? Or, just think about like, the things that, our parents taught us, you got to work twice as hard as compared to a white person to succeed in life, right? You got to be cognizant, right? My dad used to tell me that growing up, right? And I was born in 87. So, so that's been passed down. And so, I think that's a form of trauma in itself, right? The notion of learned helplessness, right? And the study around learned helplessness with the dogs in the cage, right? And the idea that, you shock a dog every time he tries to get out, eventually he learns, I'm not even going to try. But then that dog teaches their puppies that, and it's perpetuated, right? And so I think it's the same notion here, right? You think about some of our communities that have been disinvested, our communities of poverty, right, where there's no hope, right? So if you don't see hope, right, if you don't see anybody that's displaying any positivity or pro-social, right, if the norm is to be on the block, if the norm is to be in these gangs, to be in the streets, then you're going to model that, and it's also what's instilled, right, and intentionally, right, like unconsciously, it's just being product, right? And then we think about imagery on TV, on music, some of the things that kind of reinforce it, right, as well. I think all of that plays a part, right? So I think when we're thinking about, racism and trauma in this country and how it has impacted Black people, we have to be cognizant of it. And then we also have to think about how do we heal from this, right? And then, I think at some point, how do we heal the masses, right? Like how do we make this where it's an approach where we're able to collectively help more people, right? Where we actually get to a solution to this problem, right? Where it's not just we continue to talk about it, we continue to see this problem, but like coming up with solutions to be able to address this, to be informed, right? Like how do we equip either providers, clinicians, get more providers, clinicians that can address this need? How do we track it? How do we do data around it, right? How do we make sure that the organizations that do provide mental services to our people, right, is high quality, right? And it's just not somebody that's just seeing somebody see them, but they're not taking it to the next level to really help create that change, right? Because we know that happens too, right? There's a lot of organizations within our communities that say, hey, we're providing these services, but it doesn't mean that it's being provided at a high level, that there's some type of quality assurance or fidelity and mechanism in place to ensure that, right? So I think like, I guess for me, it's like, how do we get to that space, right? Because, I'm really big on like, how do we create solutions to the problems? What approaches do we need to take, and how do we collectively address that? Because I think that's the only way that's move the needle forward. That's the only way it's going to help us create change within our community to see what we, see something different.
And Titani brought this point up earlier about the trauma and just intergenerational trauma. Can you all speak to, and Titani in particular, you, about how coping mechanisms, both bad or good, are passed down from generation to generation, and problems seem to be unaddressed?
I think, and it's understandable. So I know some of us come from households that go way back generationally. When we talk about, in terms of, we don't talk about anything that goes on in this house, right? Let's start there, right? Like what happens in this house stays in this house, no matter what. I think that's where it starts, and not being okay with talking about what's happening, right? But like Dr. Obari said earlier, there are non-traditional approaches too, in terms of dealing with that, right? And how Dr. Larry mentioned about the yoga and the different resources. And so I think that's important as well too.
And I think a lot of it, when we talk about slavery, right, post-traumatic slave syndrome, that the source of it has to do with what did it mean for hundreds of years for us to just survive, and that'd be the best we could do. And we're grateful for those that did that, but what does it mean to evolve past survival? And a lot of these intergenerational traumas are adaptations to survival that we are just they have become a part of our culture. Things like soul food, right? There's a delicacy, right? But there's harm in there. We celebrate it. It's beautiful. We come together at the funeral for somebody to die from high cholesterol, and then we eat the same things. Like that's the passing down of an adaptation of a coping with a survival mechanism that does not allow us to heal.
But we also have to acknowledge that during that time, I'm sorry to cut you off, during that time, those coping mechanisms, that's what they knew to do, right? I think it's every generation has to figure out something different, right? I think back then, the soul food and other things, although they may be unhealthy, that was what they knew to do at that time. And I think it's important, as Aaron said, like, how do we come up with different solutions? I think the work that all of us are doing are solutions in terms of just changing some of that.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. I totally agree on that. But for now, there is very little soul in soul food. And it's not to criticize our ancestors. It's just that that's what is out there. So what we're missing is community, and it's like people have a right, once integration started, to move and live wherever they choose to, wherever they can afford to live. So I live here in the community of South Shore, and on my block on the corner, I have this sign that I can change out, and it's a quiz sign. How many countries in Africa? What street is named after Emmett Till? And I change it from time to time, and people like it. Very few people know that I'm a psychologist. So I sit on my steps and I watch the kids go to school, and I watch those who stay in the neighborhood grow up. And I say, hey, how's the report card? I've never met a lot of their parents. But it's, how's their report card? Hey, how you doing? Oh, I got a B. Why didn't you get an A? Granted that what they're learning is not that, really culturally conducive, but it is the system that they're in. And you're absolutely right, my sister. We do have to examine these things. So we have to, that's why you have to mix the young with the old. You can't separate the young with, I don't know anything about, very little about the internet. I used to have secretaries working for me. I had my look.
We're impressed that you were able to log on to the Zoom.
I know, right?
Right.
Hey, I have a 13-year-old son upstairs. But the thing is to find out what's their view, not to judge it, but to say, okay, so because they've been trained in the same stuff that we've been trained in, only now it's okay. So you always put your own personal mindset. And with young men, it's very hard. We always have this phrase, you have to meet the client where they are. And I just consider all the students that I come in contact with, or all the children that I see on the street or in schools, that they're victims of trauma. Now, that's not exactly true. But you know what? At any point, you can see somebody getting shot on the streets. Okay, and definitely, if you look at the news, you can see that. And it's a good thing for video cameras, and it's a negative part of that too. So you have to. That's why I really emphasize the schools are a point where we really need to be there, help the staff and the teachers as well, because it's a sense of community, and if the children are going to be there, the parents may be there, and it's right here. That's how I look at it.
I think also in the schools.
Go ahead.
What? Go ahead, Barry. Because like that trauma, though, I think is a key part that we just. I think I definitely want us to have more conversation around that too, right? Particularly when we think about trauma. And its impact, with the young people in school, right? What they're exposed to and what they're seeing, right? Like the impact of trauma, how it dysregulates the brain, right? And symptoms that, may look like ADHD and how trauma could be contributing to that, right? We got a lot of young people that, come to our organization and the parents think they have ADHD. Now ADHD,
and it's PTSD.
Yeah, and they're dealing with trauma, then you have a conversation and like, I see my mom abused like 5 to 10 times. I can remember every image of it, right? And then we see how the brain becomes dysregulated, right? So now you can't focus. Now you can't concentrate, right? But like as a community, I don't think we have conversations around like the impacts of trauma, the impacts of toxic stress, right? Like, like the value of the ACEs, right? Like, I mean, like everybody may have different views of it, right? But like there's some pretty
Right.
good data that's associated with it as well, right? Like a young person that's growing up in a home, you know, there's physical abuse, there's neglect, right? These household dysfunctions, how that has a significant impact on how a young person could be. Not all the time, but there's just research and data around it, right?
Yeah.
And I think like we need to educate our communities around that. Like, yo, the impact of toxic stress, right? Like the impact of if somebody's doing drugs in a household, if somebody, the impact of how a divorce can have an impact on a young person, right? Mental illness in a household, right? All these different factors are so pivotal. And I think sometimes people just don't know, right? And they don't understand why this young person may be acting out in the way that they do. And not sure, but there's things that may be contributing in the household. You know, a lot of times when we see a young person that come into our office, right? Like we're trying to get the whole picture, right? Because, you know, a lot of times it's, hey, what's going on with my son? He's acting up. I don't know why he's doing what he's doing. But a lot of times there's factors that's going on in the home. There's like a structure, something may be taking place that's causing that, right? And so like really looking at that perspective. But again, I tie it right back to ACEs, to trauma, right? And then also we talk about gun violence too. Go ahead though.
No, what were you saying? Talk about what?
Because I think also when we think about mental health and we think about, you know, the issues of gun violence, like trauma plays a pivotal role in that too, right? To what leads to that, you know? So I think we, you know, like that's something that, you know, within our communities is pervasive. I mean, it's all over, right? This is not a black issue. When we talk about trauma, this is a national issue, right? But I do believe though,
but it's gun violence. But the gun violence is specific. You talking gun violence? We talking black male shooters for the most part.
For sure.
Right.
But the notion of trauma though, trauma is just not a black thing, right? Trauma has an impact on it. So I just want to make sure we understand that trauma, you know, is.
And the other one of the things we keep letting others frame our assessments of things. So you talk about the child. I'm sorry, my sister.
No, you're fine. Go ahead.
you talk about that one child that you were talking about in a class of 30. What happens to the other that you're able to see in therapy in the office that the mother was able to bring them? Then you have, what about the other children? And young men, as well as some young women, they learn how to stuff things down. You know, because that's being a man, as a sister was saying. And no one's telling them to talk about their feelings. No one's telling them that a tear shedding on your eye, your tear ducts are there for a reason. So we have to kind of like soften it, but you have to do it in a way that's generally productive. So therapy works best when there's a long-term or good relationships. But our communities are so, you know, spread out that's why I say, hey, the school is the best place, because if someone comes to see you, if they move to another part of town, you know, they still may need a therapist, but you know, I'm not, you know, that's a long way for me to drive. But if we have a format that we can present, because no one asks us about how, what children should learn in first, second, and third grade. Yes, they have the social emotional learning program. They don't have a trauma program. And if they do get one, who's going to do it? The same people that did the social emotional learning program, none of them look like us. There's a few organizations that do some things, even out there in roles. I know Arnie Duncan is out there, and a lot of other people are in different neighborhoods, but none of us were there creating these programs.
I want to talk about.
Go ahead.
Titania, did you have a point before I move on?
It's fine. Go ahead, move on. It's okay.
I just wanted to talk about access to therapy for Black men. I look back to last summer, and you talk about trauma. I was just covering a 1-year-old shot, a 3-year-old shot, a 7-year-old shot. It was just like weekend after weekend. And one of the things that has always been troubling about my job when I was a general assignment reporter, especially working on the weekends in Chicago during the summertime, that I would often be covering crime where the victim is a Black person and the shooter is a Black person. And last summer, I just reached an end. I said, I cannot be responsible for this coverage anymore. I think it's important to cover. I just couldn't do it. I also didn't want to be around so much pain constantly. I would get anxious before going to work.
It takes
Vicarious trauma?
Yeah, it takes a toll. It's like the vicarious, Aaron's about to say the vicarious trauma, but I was going to say, to talk about some of the barriers to seeking traditional, right, psychotherapy services. When we say traditional, that's typically in the office. One of the things we do I also own a private practice in behavioral health clinic, TMH Behavioral Services. So one of the things I prided myself on was having a practice that was community-based. And what I mean is, not only are we providing services in the office, but prior to COVID, we were in the schools. We went into the homes of those who couldn't get to us, those who are chronically ill or seniors, and also nursing homes, and talking about in terms of the services we provide. And so when we think about the barriers, some of the barriers, and Dr. Cartman touched on this earlier, the mistrust of medical providers, right? We talk about taking the COVID shot, right? Socioeconomic reasons, right? Misdiagnosis, and we talked about how oftentimes young Black boys are diagnosed with ADHD when it's really PTSD.
How can they find, because to be honest, I tried to find a Black male therapist last summer. My then fiance said that you probably should talk with someone. It could be helpful. And I called around, and it was a struggle. So I ended up not.
The truth is, it's not enough of us.
Less than 4%, right? Less than 4%.
Less than 4%. And even amongst us, Aaron talking about quality services. Like, just because they're Black don't mean they do it with therapy.
I'll just say I have 15 on my team.
You got 15 Black men?
No, therapists. I have 2 Black men.
Okay, there you go. So I mean, I think part of what we're talking about is being more innovative around the approach to mental health providing vision. Period. That all the therapists I know got waiting lists, right? I don't know if how y'all doing over them.
We have a waiting list. Everybody on my team is at capacity. So if any of you guys are looking for
that's what I'm saying. That's the problem. That's the access.
Yeah, that is the issue.
What our goals, at Grow Community is that, we have roughly a team of about 15 male clinicians, right, that are able to work with this population. And number 2, we accept Medicaid, right? So individuals who are in poverty, who may not have the, traditional approach. A lot of times people shy away from that, but for us in our organization, we were creative. We wanted to be intentional about accepting that. Because, a lot of individuals that come from poverty, that's what they have is Medicaid. And so how do we continue to support them? And so, my goal is like, particularly like if a guy is reaching out for support, we want to help them, right? Because it takes a lot between, just looking at the numbers, between 50 and 60% of guys, if they know they have a mental health disorder anyway, they're not even going to seek treatment anyway. So if we can get somebody just with the motivation to say, hey, man, I need some treatment, or I need somebody to talk to, we want to make sure we fill that void and support them, So I think that's just the need of, when we talk about, support for males, right? But then also like this holistic approach, Dr. Larry talked a lot about the schools, right? Like, how do we incorporate treatment in the schools? I think that's powerful, right? Being able to collaborate with teachers, being able to see what's going on. Bar, you talked about that twinkle in the eye. One of the things that I started to notice is that our young people who may have an IEP, particularly males who struggle in school, I start seeing between 7th to 8th grade, if they don't have that support, that structure, they start to kind of fall off, right? And then they start to get to high school, they're around the same type of peers, and then they end up in the streets, right? And then unfortunately, like we see what happens, right? You end up in the streets, So I think, incorporating what you're saying, Dr. Larry, about the school approach, incorporating behavioral health in the schools, and being intentional about collaboration, but then also incorporating things that's going on at home to help them. I think that can create that change, But also we got to be cognizant of the fact too, with COVID, so many of our young kids are disconnected from school still. Right? Like you'll talk to a teacher, you talk to a principal, they still not going to school. They're not logging on, right? And they're not going back in person. So like this whole thing of COVID has definitely, like, there's been some positives to virtual, but there's also negatives that's going to have huge implications on our kids moving forward that we also have to be cognizant of. We went a whole year without structure, right? And it's particularly, individual, we need structure to survive, to thrive, particularly boys as they're growing up, like activities to keep them focused, to keep them engaged. But when that's not happening, you're not going to school. You'll have mom maybe working 2 jobs, so she can't really keep engaged. So now you just idle with friends and peers. But then we wonder why we see what we see going on as well. So I think all those things we got to be cognizant of too.
Yeah. Okay. And one thing I want to say. So we have the Zoom and the Google Meet stuff. So this is a good format, for developing. I mean, nothing beats in person, but for generally reaching a significant group of people, this is a good format. So I think something can come out of this with different organizations, like, hey, even I can come out of retirement and do something once a week You know, something
come
like
on, Dr. Larry, come over to TMH.
my back, my back and my
We're
neck.
back.
Yeah.
But you know, we have this format where we can go in and give some general information about things, but we got to have the referrals. You know, where can they go? You know, is there a sliding scale? And you know, and the system is so messed up. You know, they don't take this insurance and they don't take this insurance, and those sort of things. So there is a way to use this Zoom format as it begins to dwindle. I think it's going to be here for a long time, not just because of COVID, but because it's so effective.
Yeah.
I think we should use Zoom, but I think, you know, we talk about Black men in specific and young Black men now, that we have to be very specific about the type of therapy that even happens. And I think that there's a lot of music. This young generation, we talk about their music all we want, and every artist I know that they listen to got at least 1 or 2 songs where they really being honest for real. In a way that my generation wasn't being honest like that. They talking about their pain they're experiencing. They talking about loss, talking about grief. They're not providing good solutions to deal with it. They talking about, you know, popping pills for it, but they very open and honest in their generation. And I think they're using, like, it can't just be regular therapy. Like, we got to,
We use music.
version.
Yes, we use music a lot in our practice with our team.
Right.
So we have TMH Behavioral Services has a teen boys group and teen girls group, and we use music with our teens because we recognize that that's their language, right? Like, I'm sure you all know from experience with traditional talk therapy, oftentimes it's hard to talk to anybody about what's happening for you. So music is sort of the connector for young people with their clinicians.
You know,
I'm also curious. I have a question for y'all actually before we wrap up soon. There's been a shift in how we define masculinity in lots of ways. And while I got the you know, the folks that do men work, I'm curious about how that show up in y'all work. That these ideas of being protectors and providers, some of these old-fashioned notions that we wrestling with that. Like, we shaking a lot of that stuff up. And sometimes Black men get thrown away in the midst of it. But for those of us that still love Black men, that are Black men, that are trying to find out who we are still, why things are shifting, I'm curious about how that show up in the therapy room, in the groups. If that's something that we should be responsible for, if, you know, the aftermath of all these movements that are checking men about our patriarchy and the ways that we perpetuate violence, and Black men find ourselves on that, we straddling that fence. On the Black side, we on the bottom. On the man side, we on the top. So Black men try to sort that out. But there's a new reimagination of manhood that's showing up, and part of it is good in that, like, you know, we're not relying on saying, when I cry, I tap into my feminine side. It's just a human thing. Like, these kind of conversations are happening more often. But then there's a lot of shame also that I'm seeing. Men feel like embarrassed just to be in the body of a man just because of the way the conversations are happening. And some men are just throw the whole thing away, just tune out, and then they become super hyper masculine because of it. But I'm wondering, how do we find some balance in this generation of men who are going through a regeneration, a reimagination of how you define masculinity from its root, and how that shows up in y'all work? Sorry for Will for taking the moderator role for a second.
Modeling. I promise part of it is modeling, bro. Like, if you're growing up, you never seen a male figure, you don't know what that is. How do you know what a man is, right? Like, you know, I was blessed, right? My dad was in my life, played an integral part of my life. You know, I dedicate a lot of who I am because I saw him. I saw him waking up early in the morning. He had a video business he was doing. Like, I mean, he modeled a lot of behaviors on hard work, being consistent, right? Just being there, right? So, I mean, that's where I got a lot of my process and how I do things, right? And so, you know, I think one of the things that concern me, you know, about why I go into this work is that a lot of these young boys, they never get that example. They never saw a male figure waking up, going to work in the morning, right? They never saw somebody, you know, engaging in the household, doing activities in the household, teaching those tasks, right? So we start talking about masculinity. You got to have a man to teach masculinity, right? Like, you have to have an example, right? You have to have somebody that's modeling and showing it to you. And so I think the main thing is, like, how do we help these young brothers who never had that opportunity to learn these skills until we can actually get them connected to males to be able to show them, right? It doesn't have to be a clinician. It could be a mentor, right? It could maybe be that uncle, right? Like, but I think we have to be intentional about creating spaces or educating people about that. Like, the importance of a Black boy seeing a Black man in a pro-social light, and it's compared not to the negative light of somebody that's always on the block selling drugs, somebody that's always on the block, maybe, you know, smoking and drinking, right? Or what they see that was perceived on TV, or thinking that that's an athlete, that's the only pro-social approach, or artist, right? Like, we have to change that narrative, right? So that, you know, our young brothers are seeing that. But I think if they're able to be around and get that modeling, then, man, we get to that masculinity part. But again, if you have young brothers who've never been around a man and never known what it's like, how do you learn what masculinity is and what it should be, right? Now, of course, you know, as men in general, I think there are things that we have the bravado and the pride, you know, we all have to work on, right? And I think intentional conversations around that. But again, when we talk about just our society, our generation, I mean, there's been an uptick in single family homes in our community since the 1960s, right? We're starting at 24%, in 2018 is at 70%, right? So there's a lot of people, particularly young brothers, that are going up here and ain't got no exposure to a father or a male figure, right? And I think that has to be intentional when we start talking about masculinity.
I think, Dr. Obari, if you were simply trying to say shift the narrative of what it means to be a Black male, and more so from the standpoint of being a provider, being emotionally present. Is that what you were trying to talk about?
Yeah,
being
part of
able
what I'm
to,
curious about. Yeah,
you know, hug your son, and you know, embrace your son, embrace your best friend, and share some of your deepest thoughts that you would normally keep secret. Is that what you're talking about, and trying to shift the narrative of masculinity in terms of we shouldn't share anything, everything's fine, as you know?
And also just preaching that, you know, sharing how you feel and expressing how you feel doesn't take away from your masculinity. I think that's something we have to constantly reinforce, especially to young boys and men as well, that this notion that if I express myself a certain way, if I cry, or if I say that, you know what, this affected me, right? I'm bothered by this, that somehow diminishes my masculinity and who I am as a man.
But it does make them more vulnerable. Like, you don't want boys out here crying and because they bully roast them. Right. You don't want them at work crying because they get super, like, we have to, there are some things that we need to hold on to.
I agree. I agree. But I think that comes from what Aaron said, from modeling, right? And having these conversations. But I think it's finding a balance, right? Because I always say being vulnerable is being masculine. It's a part of your masculinity. But I think you're right. And again, I'm not a man. I'm just a man. No, but I think you're right.
We gotta, there's safe spaces that I feel more vulnerable than not. It's hard for me to seek help. I'm not gonna cry all the time.
Right. Which is why
I do create space where there's certain relationships, mostly with women, to be honest. I'm much more comfortable crying.
You gotta come to the TMH Man Cave, Dr. Obari.
But you have to be worried about
Man Cave. Listen,
everything happens at the cave.
Listen, the TMH Man Cave. Kudos to my TMH Man Cave participants who are open, who do feel brave enough to be vulnerable in that space with other men. So I mean, invite you guys out to the next one on June 12th.
So one of the things too, in addition to the modeling, you've got to give the young man some tools to say, hey, it's okay for them to do their own inventory, to recognize what they're feeling. Then the old dogs like me, you got to start peeling off the layers of the onion, because we were taught men don't show their feelings. Jim Brown, John Wayne, you don't cry. And it takes a long time. It takes a long time to peel that off and to realize that, hey, I feel sad about that. Maybe I should apologize. I didn't do that. And so I have to learn how to, first of all, I have to get some feelings to realize I'm feeling uncomfortable. And when I feel uncomfortable, it's usually something that I didn't accept, or I'm not understanding what I can change within myself. Because I'm the one who's uncomfortable about my feelings. And that's for older guys, that's a whole new ball game, because it's easy to walk through life with your hands like this, with your dukes up, because nothing can get in. I love my woman, but only so much, all that sort of nonsense. But, that's not, and then you raise children the same way.
Yeah.
You show them that that's not it. And so older guys are learning how to, if they're learning how to peel off the layers of the onion of what they've been taught, so that they can learn too how to be more open, how to feel more, how to say, man, that's hurt, and it's a difficult situation, but it can be done.
Yeah.
I'm going to the man cave.
One TMH Man Cave, that's right.
One of the things before we leave that, I really hope that we can, touch on too, is this notion of safety, particularly for our men and our boys. Like, I think what bothers, and so a lot of our work is geared towards gun violence, right? Incorporating mental health towards gun violence, right? And so we have a high population of young people we work with who are engaged either in the streets or returning home from prison, right? And one of the things that always bothers me is when a 13 or 14-year-old tells me that they don't feel safe in their community. Or like, hey, I can't walk down Wentworth, I can't walk down State, because if I walk down those streets, that could be my last, right? Like a 13, 14-year-old in the United States has to live in a certain way in which they move, in which they get around in their community, like that's tragic to me. Like this isn't a third world country. Like we're supposed to be one of the most industrialized, developed countries. But when little Black boys tell me that, this is not just one, this is a constant thing, right? And we know what safety, like we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and getting to self-actualization, self-fulfillment, right? Like number 2 is safety, right? Once all your basic needs are met, food, water, etc., safety is number 2. And I think one of the biggest challenges that our young people are dealing with is safety. Like, and I can't get on the CTA bus. I get on the CTA bus, man, there may be somewhere right there to get me, right? And like, how do we find spaces? How do we create these spaces for our young people so they can feel safe, right? Because like, if you don't feel safe, then that creates the hyperarousal, the anxiety, right? Hypervigilant, right? All things we see that's associated with trauma. But then it just continues to edge our young people on. Then you become even more impulsive. Then you react even quicker, right? But like this whole notion of like creating safety, instilling safety, right? I think it's one of the challenges that I deal with on a regular. But like, how do I help somebody say, hey, change your life? You know, somebody say, I'm gonna take the steps. I'm gonna go to school. I'm gonna start working. But hey, you know, I work at McDonald's. That person I'm into could walk in at any time, and then that's my life, right? Like, I mean, that's a valid point that our young people are dealing with. So even the notion of I want to change, and I start that process, all the people I'm still into it with, they still gunning for me at any moment they could get me, right? So I think, like, again, going back to this whole ideal of safety, and I think our community needs to understand that it's young brothers out here that are just scared, right? They're, you know, they've been either in a community where they were involved with it, maybe they didn't want to, but it just happened. But now I have to live with this heightened sense of hyper arousal or hypervigilance. And I think we got to have more. I feel like there needs to be more conversation around it because there's a lot of young people out here, a lot of young brothers out here that's dealing with that. And we quit to victimize them, say they thugs and things like that, but not really understanding what they're dealing with and battling because they can't even have safety. Like that's super important.
We're going to need a community approach for that, I think, in terms of creating that safety, that sense of safety. I think we've had it at one point in our history, but then it went away. And I know that's a whole nother conversation, but I think it's the community approach. And I think that's what's missing from Maslow's hierarchy, Aaron, the community approach.
Yeah, you've got to have a safe, because that's how I grew up in Woodlawn, formed Blackstone Rangers and stuff. I did not go to high school. I did not go to Hyde Park because I've lived 3 blocks away and I couldn't. But I read a lot. I read comic books, Greek mythology, Latin mythology. I loved to read until I could get out. I was running all the time. Still love to run. Till I could get out of my plan, because I didn't have any man guiding me, was to join the Army when I got 18 and get out of the South Side, get out of Woodlawn. And to me, that was a brilliant idea. I had no idea that there was a war going on in Vietnam till I got there. You see, so I see what you're saying. I came up with an idea, but it's like, wait a minute. They were shooting at me back on Blackstone. Now they're shooting at me over here in Vietnam. Something didn't go right with my plan because I didn't have a safe place or some guidance to show me that, hey, you know what? Here's a place.
Well, Dr. Larry, we have to end it there. We have to wrap up here. I want to thank, this is such a great conversation. I want to thank each of our guests for their time today. These are important conversations, important that we understand that we can each play a role in the physical and mental health of one another. Thank you all for what you're doing, whether through your work, direct service programs, or providing opportunities for so many Black men to come together in a safe environment, free to share their particular fears or concerns and work towards healing, which is extremely important. We hope this has been an informative discussion for those watching, and we thank all of you who spent the hour with us. This is our Chicago, and we all have to play a part in it. I'm Will Jones. Stay safe and healthy, and have a good rest of your day, and go get help if you need help. Thank you.
Thank you.
Namaste. Thank you all.
Thank you. Be well, be safe.